Welcome back to episode 2 of my Leipzig project / Napoleonic tutorial series. If you are following along with the start of your own new collection, then alongside a catalogue of figure manufacturers and content creators with which to familiarise yourself, you should also have a short list of possible armies or campaigns around which to theme your new project. But before all this window shopping and wish listing results in a mountain of lead, plastic and resin, it's worth considering how to plan out and structure your collection. So, today I'll be giving a thorough run through of orders of battle. What are they? How do you make sense of them? What can they tell us? How do they integrate or not with rule sets? And what about that dreaded word, points? For a couple of examples throughout this video, rather than just reeling off a glossary of terms, I'll be looking at several battles from 1813, like Dresden, as featured in the painting on screen now. Hopefully this means there'll be something of interest for everyone, whatever your familiarity with the topic. Last thing before we get started, I just want to say a huge thank you for the support and encouragement people have shown the first episode of this series. I wasn't sure how it would land given the fantasy stuff I'd done previously, but I've really been bowled over by how it's been received, so thank you. On to part 1. Sometimes abbreviated to Orbat, OOB or OB, an order of battle is simply a list of the various units that participated in a given battle or campaign, including some details about their disposition and strength, and arranged hierarchically to show the command structure. There are tons of these available, like the ones which George Nafziger has compiled, which I'll be using for examples in this video. His site is linked in the description. They can prove invaluable for wargamers when it comes to understanding things like the types of unit you might want to include in your collection, and the ratio in which they would have been fielded historically, the identity of various units and commanders who fought alongside one another in the sector of a battlefield, and the impact of things like attrition on a formation across the duration of a campaign. The first thing to run through is, of course, what these different levels in the command structure mean, from field army to corps, division, brigade, regiment, battalion, and in some cases, companies. If you're already comfortable with these terms and the promise of historical comparisons isn't enough to entice you, then timestamps are below. So, starting at the very highest level, you'll find a reference to the army from which the order of battle belongs. This could be something like the French Imperial Army or the Sixth Coalition, each truly gargantuan in scale, and far beyond what anyone could ever really dream to collect in all but the very smallest of scales. Now, I know this is the opposite order to how most people tackle command structure, but given the whole video is about orders of battle, there's method to the madness. First, it's the way that they're written out, and second, the small organisational levels are represented only by numbers, if at all, and then need interpreting through larger structures in any case. So, nations first. This will tell you something about how to interpret what follows. Although many armies did learn from and adopt some version of the French system of organisation, there were, as to be expected, plenty of quirks in the way that each nation implemented it. So being aware of which army you're dealing with is important. We can't look at every difference of course in one video, so I'll stick to French and Prussians to cover the main bases for this project, and give enough of an introduction to Orbats for people to go away and get the main gist of other systems out there. Also, just note that there's an important difference between the army and our next step beneath it, for Napoleonics at least, of a field army. If one of these was present, then it would typically appear also at the top of an order of battle. Here, for example, is one for the Battle of Grossbeeren, where we find the French army of Berlin under the command of Marshal Oudinot, and the Allied army of the North under Bernadotte, Crown Prince of Sweden. This is a big combined arms force, meaning it contains infantry, cavalry and artillery, across a range of different types, such as line and light infantry, sometimes guard and or militia, light, medium and maybe heavy cavalry, as well as horse and foot artillery, with things like 6 and 12-pounder guns. Some of these units would be grouped together into smaller combined arms forces of their own, which we'll come to in a moment, while others would constitute a reserve to commit at the decisive point in a battle. Lots and lots of variety here then, but it's simply too big to collect for all but the most committed of hobbyists, certainly in most figure scales. We can turn this into a rule of sorts. The fewer the number of figures, the less variety you get in the type of models. You might not always see a field army listed on an Orbat. Sometimes, like at Dresden, several marshals converge to support Saint-Cyr under the command of Napoleon himself, creating a force of about the same size as a field army, but one that arose through happenstance. There can also be quite a bit of variance in the seniority and titles of those who commanded a force of this size, from Napoleon or one of his marshals, the equivalent rank in most other armies being that of a field marshal, to someone like Blücher, who was the Prussian general of cavalry for much of 1813 while commanding the army of Silesia, before eventually being promoted to field marshal during the first day of the Battle of Leipzig. This could be one important factor in how you choose what to collect. Not that you'd aim to finish an entire field army, but perhaps you're drawn to the identity of a certain marshal you wish to represent on the battlefield. One massive example of a field army is the Allied Army of Bohemia. This was an enormous amalgamation of Austrian, Russian and Prussian troops, numbering about 170,000 at Dresden, under the command of Schwarzenberg, someone who possessed various titles, both princely and military, but given his seniority in the Allied army, he can perhaps best be viewed as a generalissimo. If you have several field armies, distinguished from each other using numbers, then by convention, in English at least, these numbers should be written out in full, instead of using Arabic numerals. This doesn't really apply in the case of the Napoleonic period, but for World War II, for instance, you'd see the 1st Allied Airborne Army here as an example. In some cases, you might find a subordinate commander listed with responsibility for one large portion of a field army, like in the case of the Russian and Prussian contingent of the Army of Bohemia, which was commanded by Barclay de Tolly. In most other cases, however, the next level down is a corps. Here, as an example, we have the French Second Corps at the Battle of Dresden, a force of roughly 25,000 men, under the command of Marshal Victor. Note, by the way, these are indicated using Roman numerals. Now, despite belonging to a field army, where you might find 2 or 3 of them, the whole point of a corps was to serve as a self-sufficient, combined arms force, capable of fighting, manoeuvring and withstanding attack all on its own, until it could be reached by other corps for support. This wasn't exactly a new idea in 1800 when Napoleon adopted it. Discussion of and experimentation with such a system dates back to the 7 Years' War, but it was Napoleon who really made full use of what the corps d'armée offered in terms of mobility, independence and flexibility to separate columns of an army. Taking a closer look at Victor's Second Corps, we find again a combination of line and light infantry, 6-pounder foot artillery, some light cavalry, and, for the core assets, an artillery reserve containing 12-pounders and horse artillery, so it's kind of like a field army in miniature. The main exception here would be for the cavalry reserve, which Napoleon reorganised into corps themselves, containing some mix of light, medium and heavy cavalry, plus its own artillery, but no infantry. In terms of commanders, for the French you'd occasionally see someone below a marshal with this level of responsibility, like Van Damme with the First Corps, but typically by this time it would be a marshal in control. As for Prussia, we find again at Dresden in the Army of Bohemia, the Prussian Second Corps under the command of Kleist, a general lieutenant, and this is typical for Prussia. The First Corps in the Army of Silesia was commanded by General Lieutenant von York, and the Third Corps in the Army of the North commanded by General Lieutenant von Bülow. Most of the same things apply as with the French. Big, self-reliant combined arms forces, featuring an artillery reserve and a cavalry reserve of its own. In terms of miniatures, a corps from any nation would be a big collection in 28mm. Just to convey a sense of scale, I'll compare the number of figures used at each level of command from here on with Victor's Second Corps, since the French system is the more universal one. With rule sets like Black Powder, the exact number would vary depending on your chosen figure ratio and basing system. Displayed on screen is the more old-school, larger option, which I prefer, containing infantry units of 36 figures, cavalry of 24, and 4-gun batteries. With 1 to 3 mounted figures per command base as well, that adds up to about 1,200 figures, plus whatever you want in the way of skirmish screens. Even for a much leaner option, with infantry blocks of 24, cavalry of 12 and 1-gun batteries, it's still almost 800 miniatures. Moving another step down, this is where things really start to diverge between the French and Prussian systems. For the French, we next find a division. Here you'll typically find either infantry or cavalry, plus some artillery. Similarly to before, there's usually 2 or 3 of these to a corps. So, if we take another look at Victor's Second Corps at Dresden, we find that it contains the 4th, 5th and 6th infantry divisions, each of which is commanded by an aptly titled General de Division. If you are keeping track with a numbering system, it's also where we start to see Arabic numerals used for the first time. For comparison, with the 4th division shown here, we're still looking at about 470 minis for the larger old school option, or roughly 300 if you go for the smaller units. Still a lot to paint, but something that's pretty achievable in the long term. As for cavalry, here's a light cavalry division from Saint-Cyr's 14th Corps. Looking at the way it's labelled, you'll see the cavalry are now grouped by type, so it's specifically a light cavalry division, containing things like hussars and chasseurs à cheval, instead of heavy cavalry like the cuirassiers. Given the recommendations in some rule systems, you might be able to represent this with as few as 24 or 36 mounted figures, but I'm not a fan of that approach to cavalry units, so let's say 72 miniatures instead. Each division is typically split into 2 to 3 brigades. The artillery is separated out under its own heading on the Orbat at this point, so we find brigades consisting of a single arm of the military, that is, infantry or cavalry. Again, while cavalry are grouped by type, such as light or heavy, the infantry are sometimes still mingled together with line and light troops. Yet another figure check, and we're down to roughly 190 to 145 miniatures, depending again on figure ratio. Brigades contain a number of regiments, usually 2, written out with their number and type. So in the infantry, we have the 24th Leger Regiment, for instance, or in the cavalry, the 1st Westphalian Hussar Regiment. Regiments are administrative rather than tactical in nature. That is to say, they're organised to deal with logistics, personnel, training and so on, rather than fire and manoeuvre. They're kind of like a parent body, and possess their own unique flag or standard. In 1813, the inscription specific to each regiment in the French army would be their number on the plinth atop which the eagle is perched, as well as on one side of the flag, plus a list of battle honours on the other, limited to those at which Napoleon himself had been in command. The identity of the regiments within a brigade is the kind of thing that might prompt you to choose part of one Orbat as a focus for your collection, either because of the history of that regiment, or in the case of those nations with more differentiation between their flags, because of the colours alone. Looking once more at the 24th Leger, it's just around 96 to 72 models. And within these infantry regiments we find our battalions. These ones are tactical in nature, being treated in rule sets like Black Powder as a single individual unit on the tabletop. They're represented in Orbats by a number and a slash, before the name of the regiment to which they belong. So for the 24th Leger, we find that the 1st, 2nd and 4th battalions were involved at Dresden. It's pretty common to have only some of the battalions from a regiment present on the field, with others being designated as depot battalions. To preserve the size of this unit on the battlefield, you might also see combined battalions in some cases. The eagle and regimental flag are carried by the 1st battalion, if they took it into the field at all, while the other battalions were supposed to have simpler fanions, 1 metre square with their plain colour denoting the number of the battalion, so white for the 2nd, red for the 3rd, blue for the 4th, green for the 5th and so on, but here's an illustration of a rather more decorated example. A battalion like this is something you can create with a single box of plastic figures, usually numbering 24 or 36 miniatures to taste. Each base, meanwhile, of 4 to 6 figures, represents a company. For the French, these are of different types, including 1 of Grenadier, 1 of Voltigeur, and 4 of Fusilier within a line battalion. Companies are something you don't usually see indicated on orders of battle, such were their size, unless it's for smaller detachments of less typical troops, of which I'll show an example later with the Prussians. As for cavalry, well, about that. Whereas in the infantry, the number with a slash denotes a battalion within each regiment, for the cavalry it represents what's called a squadron. This is a smaller subunit in which cavalry manoeuvred on the battlefield. In many rule sets it's likened to the infantry company, each being represented by 1 base of figures. The cavalry regiment, meanwhile, is treated as being akin to the infantry battalion, and this is why we end up with these small cavalry units of something like 8 to 12 figures in some rule sets. So there's a rundown of the French, from field army to corps to division to brigade to regiment to battalion or squadron. Remember when I said the Prussians started to do things differently at the step below a corps? Well, they divide each corps into 4 small divisions, which confusionally they called brigades. Unlike the French, the Prussian Brigade was also a combined arms formation, containing infantry of various types and levels of experience, light or medium cavalry, and artillery. For comparison, whereas our boxes of French figures would have looked like this, here's the variety you get within a Prussian equivalent. Here, 32 model units for infantry are the norm, something which eludes most figure manufacturers, hence the slight variation in the number of boxes required. But anyway, at our bigger old school unit sizes, we're only up to 360 figures. The cavalry, by the way, are only 2 squadrons strong, hence the single box of each for the dragoons and Landwehr cavalry. With the smaller units, it's just 260 models in total. Next down the list is the regiment. By this point in 1813, the Prussians had 3 of these to a division, but each one was a different type of infantry. One of line, one of reservists, and one of Landwehr. For the line at least, another difference from the French is that rather than a regiment containing 2 or 3 identical battalions, the Prussians would have 1 battalion of fusiliers, being dedicated light infantry in that army, and 2 battalions of musketeers. This is why, rather than seeing the number 1, 2 and 3 with slashes in front of the regiment name, we instead see 1, 2 and Fuss for fusilier. The grenadiers, meanwhile, would be paired up with those of another regiment from the same province, so the 1st and 2nd West Prussian regiments for instance, to create a combined grenadier battalion. Several other armies did something similar. For the line regiment on screen, it's 97 figures or 73 with smaller units, the odd number being because of the commander. As for the cavalry, there are usually 4 squadrons in a regiment. Although in the cavalry reserve you would see whole regiments fielded together as the norm, this wasn't the case in the combined arms brigades, where you typically find 2 squadrons of Landwehr cavalry plus 2 of a different light or medium cavalry regiment. Then we come to the humble Prussian battalion. 4 rather than 6 companies, and all of the same type, so all musketeers or all fusiliers, commonly 32 or 24 figures. You'll also on occasion find units beneath the size of a battalion listed on a Prussian order of battle. So in the 9th Brigade of the 2nd Corps at Dresden, we find 2 companies of Silesian Schützen. Well, this is proving to be a bit of an epic already, so before we start drowning in minutiae, I should stop there and summarise ever so briefly what we've looked at so far from a wargamer's perspective. First, we said that although higher levels of command exist above it, the Corps was intended to be capable of functioning independently, as a self-sufficient force. Second, that beneath the Corps, as you move down in the command structure, where assets like some of the heavy artillery cease to appear, and the focus shift from combined arms formations towards infantry or cavalry, the variety of units begins to decrease rapidly. Third, some nations had this shift away from combined arms at different points in the command structure, so below that of a corps or division. And fourth, that although the corps d'armée was widely adopted, the terms used and the definitions weren't exactly universal, with some armies establishing their own versions of the system. So, as wargamers, what use do we have for all of this? The first and most obvious option is just to adhere strictly to a specific order of battle when constructing your collection, following the exact number of battalions in each brigade, with the correct flags and uniform distinctions, possibly while following the rough size of each battalion as well, using the options for different unit frontages in your chosen rule set. Black Powder, for instance, has recommended sizes for tiny, small, regular, and large units. You could do this with the intention of refighting one part of a particular battle, or as a starting point for something representative of a certain campaign. In games like Black Powder, General d'Armée 2, and Valor and Fortitude, the rules are pitched at about a divisional level, with the option to expand them upwards to the size of a corps. So that's where you should start looking. And all these rule sets will be written in such a way that players can of course just use orders of battle, while ignoring the point system, or what have you, that might be provided in the rulebook. Sometimes, however, this will require you to be a bit creative when considering how those units interact with the rules. One problem you might face is to do with the availability of unit profiles for everything covered on the order of battle that you've chosen. In Black Powder, for instance, the rules for Prussians are found in Albion Triumphant Volume 2, which is based on the 100 Days campaign, by which point all the former regiments of reservists that fought in 1813 had been redesignated and renumbered as line troops, meaning there simply isn't a unit profile for Prussian reservists in the book. So, given these challenges you might sometimes face, the second option is to retain some flavour of a given order of battle, maybe in terms of the identity and types of troops, where possible, who fought under the leadership of a single general, while otherwise deferring to the method of force organisation laid out in your rules point system. Depending on how flexible the rulebook's options are, you might be able to just transfer the order of battle directly onto its template, but often you'll find that some brigades have an unusual number of battalions, or otherwise deviate in some way from the norm, in terms of which units they featured and in what ratio they appeared compared to others. Your third option is just to throw all of this out the window, letting the rules point system do the work for you, while just painting up whatever options take your fancy. As you might suspect from the length of this video, I rather enjoy the process of comparing all of these orders of battle, and so I decided to take the first route, of theming my collection around one Prussian brigade, which we remember is roughly the size of a small French division, as it appeared at several battles in 1813, one of which of course was Leipzig. But how do you choose just one from so many? To answer that, we need to look at some of the changes that took place in the Prussian army over the course of 1813. During the spring campaign, for which the two major battles were Lutzen and Bautzen, Prussian brigades featured a mix of battalions from different regiments. Here, for instance, is Horn's brigade in York's 2nd Corps, which included 6 line battalions of musketeers and fusiliers drawn from the 1st and 2nd West Prussian Infantry Regiment, as well as the 1st and 2nd Silesian Infantry Regiment. Lots of variety in terms of flags and distinctions, but not much use for fighting the later battles of the autumn campaign, like those at Grossbeeren, Dresden, Katzbach, Kulm, Dennewitz, Wartenberg, and Leipzig. Although raised in March 1813, the Landwehr only featured in brigades after the 9-week armistice of Pleaswitz, which separated the two campaigns. So, to follow an order of battle for these later actions, you'd need a bunch more figures in completely different uniforms than those from Lutzen. The truce also saw the regrouping of the reserve infantry into 12 discrete regiments of their own, separate from the parent or Stamm regiments to which they'd originally been attached, as 3rd Musketeer or Reserve battalions and the like. So, to have a more versatile collection, which could be used in more scenarios, I limited my search to the ones post-armistice. Then I looked at the availability of miniatures. Through dealings with the British, some units of the Prussian reserves in the autumn campaign, like the 2nd and 3rd battalions of the 5th Reserve Infantry Regiment, wore either blue or green British coats with stovepipe shakos, while others, like the 1st Battalion of the 8th and 9th Reserve Infantry Regiments, wore Portuguese coats. Some even had slight modifications to their Prussian uniforms, like how the 1st Battalion of the 6th Reserve Infantry Regiment had tails on their grey jackets. So, to keep it simple, I stuck with brigades that featured the normal grey reservist uniform, for which Wargames Atlantic sells a box containing 60 plastic figures. Cavalry as well might be a concern here. Warlord Games has sets in resin for the different Prussian cavalry units, but I'm not a huge fan of those sculpts. Perry does all the cavalry in metal, as well as plastic options for dragoons, Uhlans and Landwehr cavalry. If you want, you could convert some of the other sets, I guess, to create Prussian hussars as well in plastic. Another step, purely subjective, was looking at the flags I liked, and so putting all these together brought me to the 10th Brigade. At Dresden and Kulm, this brigade was at its full strength, with 3 battalions each of line and reservists, 4 of Landwehr, 2 squadrons of the Neumark Dragoon Regiment, and 2 of Landwehr Cavalry, and a 6-pounder foot battery. At Leipzig, however, through attrition, we find just 2 combined battalions of reservists and Landwehr are left, while the dragoons were placed instead with the 11th Brigade. So, Leipzig is a good starting point to aim for, being slightly smaller at just 7 infantry battalions and 2 cavalry squadrons. Dresden and Kulm are slightly expanded options, containing 10 infantry battalions and 4 cavalry squadrons, while the addition of 2 battalions from the 1st West Prussian Infantry Regiment, the West Prussian Grenadier Battalion, 1 battery each of foot and horse artillery, and 4 more squadrons of dragoons would give you the entire Lower Silesian Brigade for things like Lutzen. And there we have it. To do the same for any other army, pick a campaign like we discussed in the first video of the series. Then download a handful of Orbats and get used to the typical structure you see in the chosen force. Consider what would give you some versatility to the collection so that you're not too limited regarding battles and scenarios. Check out what miniatures are available, and see if there are any particular units you desperately want to paint because of their uniforms or flags. And if at any point it becomes too much faff, then just look at a point system instead, and that will get you headed in the right direction. Hopefully this video's been of some help to someone out there. It's certainly the most ambitious one I've put together so far. As always, your support, whether that be in terms of comments, likes or subscribing to the channel, is much appreciated. And stay tuned for more updates on the project. Here's a quick work in progress shot of some reservists I've done the base coats on. These are the plastic Wargames Atlantic ones, to which I'll be adding a couple of Perry metals to spice up the battalions a bit. Anyway, good luck with all your hobbying, and until next time.